we're all people, and we all want to feel valued. I think at the end of the day, we want to know that the work we're doing matters, and we ultimately matter. And that exists in work as well. And I think it's something that a lot of people overlook or maybe don't pay enough attention to. And I will say, I don't know that you can over-index on that. I mean, work has to get done. Like, you have to make decisions and be productive and all that, of course. But there's a human element that if you lose sight of that, it becomes much more difficult to, accomplish or push toward any desired outcome.
Hello and welcome to the Making Better podcast, where we help business leaders make their teams and organizations better. The goal of this show is to give you actionable insights to help improve your own performance and the performance of those around you. Our guest today is Patrick MacKelvie. Patrick and I met several years ago when he was the vice president of sales at Cornerstone, one of the largest and most well-known learning management systems out there. He has since moved on to Remote, an HR platform whose goal is to make running global teams simple. In this discussion, we dive into the idea of remote work, what it is, and what it takes to be successful. You can expect to learn about the tools required to make remote work, the types of roles that lend themselves to remote work, and some of the best ways to build trust in a remote environment. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you that if this is your first time listening to the show, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you're already subscribed, then I would humbly ask that you share this show with at least one other person, because that, after all, is how we grow. So with that, let's get into the discussion with Patrick MacKelvie. Patrick, welcome to the Making Better podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Matt. Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited. We've known each other for a while now, through your time at Cornerstone, and I'm really excited to talk today about really the topic, which is where you work now. You work at a company called Remote, which is all about remote work, and we can talk a little bit more specifically about them in a little bit if you want to. But I'd love to start off the conversation because before we started recording, you mentioned something really interesting to me about the idea how your whole career has been in sales, and though sales is very remote oriented, because you got sales people all over the place, that human touch is really important. And I think I'd love to hear you riff on kind of that a little bit and what you've gained from that, because I think it is that predicament that so many leaders find themselves in today, of they're having to lead remotely, but they also know how important that human touch is. What has your experience been like that during your time in sales?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but when I started my sales career, I was still, printing out directions via MapQuest and
Yes.
hopping in a Hertz rental car, hoping it had the never lost system so I could find where I was going. And if anyone canceled an appointment midstream, I was sunk because I would always do those directions sequentially.
Yes.
So like technology has been so beautiful in so many ways, and it saved us so much time. But I think you run the risk of losing some of that human element about which you spoke. And the reality is, sales is a people business. People are buying from people, and so anything that runs the risk of putting space, time, distance in between that, I think potentially it exposes risk. It makes the process kind of a little bit more. Just a little bit more difficult potentially. So, yeah, I think, I've been remote for many years, like probably 20, it's been like 20 years since I've had an office, but always on planes and scheduling appointments with people and internal meetings and that. And, COVID obviously threw us all for a loop in so many ways, but I think it really made so many of us, myself included, stop and think about, is it worth it to get on this plane? Do I actually need to do this? And that's kind of the environment we're still living in, so kind of seeing the effects
Yeah.
of that, positive or negative. So I think it's challenging. And as a leader, you have to spend a little bit more time thinking through and being more deliberate, specifically about how you manage people, because again, it's a relationship business, and you run the risk of becoming disconnected if you're not paying attention to those things and potentially leaning in.
Yeah, it feels like actually there could be a lot of corollaries there. And I imagine in sales, there's a lot of salespeople who think it's all about the deal, right? Like it's all about the numbers or the money or the outcome or whatever it is, and skip over kind of the relationship piece. I know especially new managers, I certainly fell into this of you think it's like it's all about the projects, it's all about the deadlines, it's all about the work, and it leads to this almost like emptiness. And so
Mm.
when you were in sales, I guess so you're moving around a lot. how did you find that balance? And especially like during COVID, I think when COVID started, most of us, what we would hear is this all of a sudden, oh, people are willing to sign $100 million deals via Zoom calls. Like, we don't need to ever travel again. Um, and the same could be said with then the work world of, oh, people are willing to do all this work just totally remotely. Where did you find, how is that right and how is that wrong? Like, when is that right and when is it wrong?
Yeah, I think in sales, ultimately, you're trying to earn trust.
Yeah.
You want to, you sort of, in an ideal scenario, we talk about it like you want to get on the same side of the table as your buyer, your potential buyer, and when you can do that, and there's kind of this trusted advisor status. It's almost like mythical in some ways that you're always trying to earn. Pick your sales book, and it's all in there. They may call it something slightly different. But trying to do that remotely, presents some unique challenges. I think if you can sit down, it's no different than just relationships. Just to sit down across the table from somebody and have a cup of coffee or share a meal, you build rapport, and start to build that foundation of trust. And like I said earlier, you're ultimately buying from people. So if you put obstacles in the way of that, I think it becomes inherently more difficult, to really establish that trust. And I really believe no matter how good your product is, or how acute the need is, if you fail to establish that trust, then you're really putting yourself at risk of not being able to lead that to a successful outcome. So I think the remote piece of it, we just had to get a little bit more creative about how we do that. And COVID, sort of thrust us into this whether we liked it or not. And so I think, it wasn't so much the salespeople of the world pushing this forward and trying to drive toward more of a remote outcome, a disconnected outcome, async outcome, or format, I guess I should say. But the world kind of thrust that upon us. So thankfully, it wasn't the us forcing it on the market. I think the market kind of, or the world maybe at large, sort of forced it upon us. So we were all in it together,
Yeah.
and that certainly made things a little bit easier, for us, a little bit more synchronous than they might have been otherwise. But it still presents a ton of challenges, and you see now with all the return to work, focuses. It seems like every day there's another, Fortune 5, Fortune 100 company who's taking some stance on that. And so part of it is just understanding culturally what makes sense for that organization, what their expectations are, how they buy, how that may have shifted, and again, trying to kind of meet them where they are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's we can make the full jump now into just talking to managers and leadership, because I think it is the same thing, right? When it comes to management, the number one thing that you're trying to do is build trust, and it's all about figuring out how to build trust, what trust looks like in your organization. Speaking of, like you said, we keep seeing every couple weeks a different Fortune 500 company is doing return to work or changing their policy or whatever it is. From your perspective, I think you have a really good perspective looking out at the business world. What is the current landscape? And I don't know, maybe there's even like levels of what it even, I think we say remote workers as kind of this catch-all phrase, but there's probably a lot of different flavors to what it means to be remote. What are you seeing?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, so. One important definition, and I kind of learned this, or it certainly became steeped in it coming to remote. My current company is, there's remote work, meaning you're not existing in a physical office. You're maybe doing that on a part-time basis and working from home. And a lot of us have been. I mean, it depends on your career, but I would say in technology and sales, there are a lot of recruiting is another huge one. There have been, I think we've been taking steps to kind of becoming more distributed over time. The sort of extreme example of that is going full asynchronous. And remote as a company was founded on a not only a remote basis, as the, the name implies, but also on an async basis.
Mm,
Um, that's specifically fascinating, and I had not worked in an environment like that before. So there's a big cultural element to that, for sure, and it takes I think strong leadership who set that vision and the expectation of what that means. And it also makes you really lean on technology to find ways to collaborate truly asynchronously, because as you can imagine, without the proper tools, it's very difficult, if not impossible.
yes.
And then you couple that with us, and I think many companies being global workforces, truly global workforces, and you're dealing with time changes and things like that. But there are a ton of advantages to it too, and I'm happy to chat about that as well.
Yeah, I would actually love to dive into that, because I do think it is. they are, they're different ideas, but they're very similar. And for anybody who's interested, I'm a big listener of Jason Fried and the book Rework, and his company Basecamp, and there's a book called A World Without Email, and Deep Work, that talks a lot about these concepts of how to allow people kind of more freedom to focus on the work rather than everything else. And it all comes back to those tools. Yeah, I think, what have you found, I guess, specific to that asynchronous piece, what have you found trickiest? And you mentioned some of the tools and technologies that enable it. What are some of those?
Sure. Yeah. By the way, our remote's co-founder, Joop Vandervoort, has a fantastic masterclass that he put out on this. It's like 30
Mm,
minutes. So drop a plug in there for that. That kind of
great.
explains a lot of these things conceptually much more eloquently than I can. He's a brilliant guy who I'm grateful to work for. But yeah, I think there were certain roles, jobs, roles, functions, I guess, that lend themselves more to async work. And and our co-founder Marcelo Lebre, he's Portuguese, so I'm probably mispronouncing that. Sorry, Marcelo. It doesn't roll quite off my Anglo-centric tongue, quite the same. But they're engineers by trade, and
Yeah.
so in coding and code collaboration, Yob was at a company called GitLab before, that is kind of code collaboration software for those who are unfamiliar. They found extreme benefit, and I think like advantages literally over the competition in being able to work this way. And so they took a lot of those lessons learned and culturally integrated them into remote when they founded it. So the ability, the freedom to work async actually makes you, to your point, Matt, some of the books you were mentioning conceptually and otherwise, you're more productive because you've got more time to focus on work when it's convenient to focus on work, and more time to focus on life and everything outside of work and in the times that are not work focused. So there's a lot of autonomy and a lot of freedom there for sure. And I think folks, there are some potential risks and pitfalls for folks that are not used to working in those environments, and you've got to sort all that out. I think again, just having strong leadership and vision about around what what's ultimately expected, and
Yeah.
being able to still get your stuff done and be productive is probably the critical key there, and then everything else falls into line. Tools wise, I mean, we are huge users of Slack, and so that is certainly, it can be an async tool for sure. It can be a
Yeah.
very like noisy sync tool. So I think finding balance with some of those things for sure. Love Slack, by the way, but it needs to be kind of controlled
Yep.
in some
Absolutely. You
ways.
got to have, you got to have policies, and or at least like procedures for best practices for how to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we use another tool called Notion, and
Oh yeah.
I was actually not. I was familiar with the company before. I'd never used it before coming to remote, and it's two things. One, I think the tool, for those not familiar, it's not dissimilar to like a Google Doc or something, just a shared documents essentially. So you can share information, and you can restrict that. You can open it up kind of globally to your entire company and that sort of thing. But remote also has a really open, communication policy, essentially, where most of those things take place, most discussions, most documentation takes place in public forum, and so it's really interesting the productivity that can be gained sort of indirectly by just somebody taking a look at something that maybe wouldn't have had access to it. And certainly in a sync environment where you're in a meeting room, the doors closed, there's conversations going on. A lot of that gets lost, and I think a lot of organizations feel this, where things just don't get documented and they kind of go away. They live
Yeah.
in the head of somebody. And if Matt, we're working on a project, you win the lottery tomorrow and you go away, a lot of that knowledge walks out the door with you. So I find that to be a super helpful tool. But again, like culturally, it has to be positioned the right way, to your point about Slack, and then adopted correctly and sort of utilized correctly to ultimately work the way it was intended.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. Even beyond the tools, before that, you mentioned the fact that, certain kinds of work lend themselves more to this kind of stuff. I guess both on an asynchronous level and on a remote level. Um, what do you think are some of the attributes for whether it's individual roles or teams that fit this kind of work better than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think things it could just be functions within roles, right? Like there are just certain things like research or anything that's independent work. I mean, we mentioned software engineers before. I mean, a lot of that can be done, and I'm not a software engineer, so I don't mean to overstep for any software engineers listening. But my observation is that there's a lot of that can be done, sort of independently, and you come
Yeah.
together and collaborate on things. But big chunks of that work can ultimately be done independently. In the sales function, it's a lot of the research, the process work, things that we're doing to put together demos or presentations, those sorts of things. I think a lot of the strategy work, researching accounts and doing a lot of that certainly lend themselves more to async. And then there are collaborative elements, whether you're a software engineer or a salesperson, where there are certain functions that I think just lend themselves more towards synchronous work. And anything that's that is prospect facing or customer facing, kind of people facing, I guess, those you have to sort of meet your, like we were talking about earlier, kind of meet your buyer, your customer, your prospect where they are. And so a lot of it is we can't take away some of the synchronous work like that. I don't think it'll ever go away. I mean, never
Yeah.
never say never. I don't see a path to that immediately. So it makes you prioritize the things that you can do async more, to have more time, energy, dedication to the things that have to be synchronous.
Yeah. And so I'm guessing those things that need to be synchronous, earlier in the discussion, we were talking a lot about trust.
Hmm.
And that's obviously one of them. So in these roles where you do have it, just it makes sense. You can be more efficient, you can get the work done, you can have better work-life balance, whatever it is, when you're working remotely or asynchronously. What have you done when you've been in those roles where that's kind of the reality? What have you done to build that trust on your team to make sure that there is still that human connection?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it, especially, and I'm fairly new at remote. I'm in my third month here, and so I just kind of went through this where you're meeting a new team for the first time and kind of inheriting certain roles and responsibilities and projects and all the rest of it. And a big part of that is just listening. I was would be remiss not to give credit where credit's due. When Cornerstone's current CEO Himanshu Pasule came in, he talked about he basically just went on a listening tour for a month,
Hmm.
and wasn't making any big decisions. Wanted to just truly talk with folks, understand where they are, get perspectives on things. And I really appreciated that. And so I've tried to do the same thing here at remote, and I think it's a best practice I'll carry with me going forward. Just to understand. I mean, people want to be heard for sure, and then it's all kind of about the follow up from there. So it's not making promises I can't deliver on, certainly, but making sure that folks know that I'm listening, they're heard, and we're going to do something with that. It's not just a one and done conversation, or a note that gets shoved in a folder somewhere. But we're actually doing something with that. And I think listening continues to be. It sounds a little cliche, I guess, or maybe overly simplistic, but it's so important. Just communication as a whole. Folks, we're all people, and we all want to feel valued. I think at the end of the day, we want to know that the work we're doing matters, and we ultimately matter. And that exists in work as well. And I think it's something that a lot of people overlook, or maybe don't pay enough attention to. And I will say, I don't know that you can over-index on that. I mean, work
Yeah.
has to get done. Like, you have to make decisions and be productive and all that, of course. But there's a human element that if you lose sight of that, it becomes much more difficult to accomplish or push toward any desired outcome.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that because as we're talking, this will be after this all happens, but I just wrote and scheduled my LinkedIn post for tomorrow. And it said the one piece of advice I have for all new managers is just stop talking. Because I think that's just, as you're a new manager, you're like, I want to prove myself. I want to show why I got promoted, show that I deserve to be here. And you just
Yeah.
sit there in every meeting, you just talk. And you need to just stop talking because people really want to be listened to. What I hear you saying there a little bit is sounds like when you say human element, the human element is still required. That doesn't necessarily mean face to face human element that in a remote environment, because I think that's a little bit different. I think it's Andreessen Horowitz through the
Mhm.
pandemic, they went fully remote, but they make sure, I forget if it's quarterly or triannually, to have a big meetup where they bring the whole organization together in person. What do you think, again, with this idea of building trust, listening is a huge thing. But some, what of that building trust and relationship can happen just by being more deliberate through technology versus trying to remove the technology and make sure, no, really, like we need to meet as people. Do you think, what do you
Sure.
think?
Yeah, I mean, I find value in both. I recently had the opportunity to get together with, recently, it's been 6 weeks ago, with a portion of my team. We were exhibiting at South by Southwest down in Austin,
Nice.
and it was great. It's awesome. I think as a new employee, let alone manager, just to sit on a trade show floor and listen to people talk about your product and the positioning, and there's some beauty in that. But the most beneficial thing for me, honestly, was going out to dinner with people
Yeah,
and just sitting down and hearing about their life and their kids and their pets and their hobbies and some of those things. And you can certainly do that over technology. I think the one distinction I would make is we tend to look at technology as work, right? We use these tools as productivity tools for work.
sure.
And there are other deployments, and any of us who worked and lived through the pandemic, I think we're all sick of virtual happy hours and those sorts of things. So it doesn't have to bleed into that space
Yeah,
entirely, but just to take a second and check in, in a one-on-one conversation with one of your direct reports or team members. Doesn't have to be a hierarchical thing. Just check in and see how they're doing, and I think just caring personally. I mean, I go back to Kim Scott, radical candor, right? Caring personally, challenging directly.
yes.
The caring personally part is, I think, the harder one to wrap your head around. And just taking a couple minutes to do that, I find it goes a heck of a long way.
So then, if I hear you correctly, if I kind of recap what we've talked about so far from like an organizational level, there's three things that I think I've at least taken away so far, and that's, at an organizational level for remote work to work, it's about, making sure the jobs that you're doing are the right, that lend themselves to this, that you have the tools in place, the systems, like that kind of thing, that you're deliberate about how you're using the tools, but then that you don't just use those tools for work. And this is what you were just saying. Of you also, since you're primarily, doing things electronically, that you don't only think about work in those times, and that you use that time to actually make a connection. But then finally, the third thing, there's still no substitute for in-person interaction. And every now and then, if you can find a way to do it, like those three pillars feel like kind of the big things from an organizational level to be thinking about. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say the thing that kind of underlays all of that is culture. And as leaders,
Mm,
I think it's on us to set the expectation and actually sort of, demonstrate the behavior, if
yes.
you will, to say like, hey, this is how this is how you can do this successfully, or this is what good looks like. Maybe not in a limiting fashion, but this is how it works for me.
Yeah.
And I think teams do, take on a little bit of the personality of their leadership, whether they
Absolutely.
realize it or not. So I think that's really important. And our founders here at Remote have done that. I mentioned Himanshu Pasule at Cornerstone. I think there's a lot of great examples out there. A lot of people that are doing elements of this very, very well.
Yeah. So then bringing it down from the organizational level to, maybe some of those frontline managers or individual managers in an organization. You've led remote teams. What are some keys things that managers should be thinking about, that managers can influence to make a remote team successful, you think?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think demonstrating some of those behaviors,
Yep.
like we talked about, so sort of leading from the front is important. Kind of what best practice looks like. I think with anything, in not just limited to remote work, but being really clear on expectations. I find like most people generally want to do well. If you give someone a
Yeah.
goal, they want to try to hit or exceed that goal, right? And the vast majority of people. So I think one of the places things break down most often from leadership or management is we're not super clear in that expectation, and then you get kind of mixed results, and that's on you. I think that's or on us, the proverbial you, as the leader, and a lot of leaders don't realize that, and so the cycle kind of continues and perpetuates. So I think that's really important. I think finding ways to just getting creative with how teams collaborate. Cross functionally, just finding more opportunities for people to come together. Certainly in person if you can, and we think about the social pieces of that. But I would say it's hard to substitute the productivity that can happen in a room. Flying
Yeah.
everybody in, it's expensive, and it's time consuming, and it's costly, and opportunity costs and all the rest of it. But there've been, few well-organized meetings I've attended in my career where I thought, well, that was a waste of time, or that was, that wasn't productive. We didn't get
Yeah.
things done. So I think there's opportunities for managers to get creative and find those opportunities, find those avenues, I guess, where you can bring people together. And sometimes it's as simple as just asking the question, get a little budget approved and away you go. And then I think getting creative beyond that in situations where you can't get together. And I mentioned the Zoom happy hour, and I'm not gonna push or advocate for that. But
No, no, not
yeah,
gonna not gonna die on that stake, on that hill.
no, no, it's I think I'd lose about half my team right away if they listen to the podcast. But finding other opportunities for collaboration, and some of this stuff can certainly be async. I think Zoom, Google Meeting, whatever your video conferencing tool of choice. I mean, there's a lot of great avenues just to bring people together and get on camera and have those conversations. I was actually just talking with one of our HR leaders today too. I think the opposite is also really valuable. She and I took a call with cameras off because we both
Yes.
had stuff going on and we're busy. And if that point wasn't made with all the Zoom fatigue and whatnot during the pandemic, I don't know.
I
I don't know if I
can't
need to
tell
remake
you
it.
I can't tell you how happy I am whenever I'm, doing prospecting for my own business when somebody schedules a phone call instead of a Zoom call. I'm like, excellent.
Kind of old school, but it can be a beautiful thing. And I think just being honest, with yourself, and your team about setting those expectations. Because sometimes this is going to sound kind of funny, but sometimes it's almost like permission. Like people feel like they need permission to
Mm,
turn their camera off.
hmm.
So, it doesn't have to be that way. I think that has this weird like hierarchical construct that's probably unnecessary. But as a leader, I think it's important to think about that. Are you demonstrating that? Another thing at remote that's really encouraged, and all the way up to our CEO and our president, our co-founders, is scheduling in things that are actually happening in your life on your calendar, so people don't book meetings over
Mm,
them. So don't
hmm.
no reason to hide that you're going to the gym or that you want to pick your kid up from school. It's actually encouraged, like take that time, and that's kind of part of async culture. I think that's really really positive. You sort of have permission to do those sorts of things and be open about them, which I think is a very healthy. It creates a very healthy environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it all comes back to that cultural piece. And I think with everything you were just saying, one of the biggest takeaways that I've always thought of when it comes to remote work is just everything has to be more deliberate.
Mm.
There's all these small things. Well, you mentioned collaboration or how meetings work and how meetings run. They just, because we've done it for so long, there's just a much more natural flow when it's in person. Everybody kind of knows the ground rules, they know how the things work, whereas we don't have that in the remote world. And so everything that between, it's new to so many of us, and just the filter, or, the separation caused by the technology, it just means everything is just that much more deliberate. If you don't,
Sure.
if you as the manager don't take the time to see a collaboration opportunity and connect one person with the other person and say like, hey, I think you two, this might be interesting for you. It doesn't have to be a big effort. Like it can just be a quick Slack message. But if you don't do that, then the chances of it happening are much lower in a remote environment than in an in-person environment. um,
Yeah, I think that's true. And I one of a thought that triggered in my mind when you were talking about too is just empowering your people to
mm,
your teams to collaborate. Like I don't always need to be in the room, right? Like I love it
yes.
when things happen super organically and I'm there to help, but I don't want them to feel like I have to have oversight on all that. And also, skip level meetings and all the rest of it. I think there's like almost like an assumed ego component with managers, and
Hmm.
you can try to be approachable and disarming and friendly and all those things. But sometimes too, if you haven't stood in a room, like if you don't know how tall I am, you may not know you got kind of how to interpret some of those things either. Right. It's just kind
Yeah.
of, there's a weird corollary there or something. But I think, yeah, I mean, just stating some of those things rather than assuming is so important to just, and that probably transcends to, most things in leadership, to always give those things a name, give them some airtime versus just assuming that it's something that people know inherently. And, the remote dynamic, I think, is a great example of that. Don't just assume that people know how to do this or how to execute at a high level.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it also goes back to all of those things that we all know from, writing emails or text messages about how much information doesn't transfer across. And I'll never forget, I always share this story where it was just some random day, middle of the week, where I wanted to meet with somebody on my team. and I just sent, not even thinking about it, I just sent them a quick note of just like, hey, can we meet in 5 minutes, or something innocuous like that. And he came over and he rushed over immediately and was just like, is anything wrong? Like, just because it was kind of a relatively curt email, I suppose, because it was just one line. He thought I wanted to meet about something that had gone wrong. And like, that didn't even enter my mind, And so, all of that kind of stuff just gets translated to every form of communication, essentially, when we're working remote. So it makes sense. Yeah. I love that. Just taking the time to make sure to clearly declare everything or give permission to everything or something like that, I think is probably a
Yeah, I
really
think
good
so.
idea.
And setting expectations, like my wife and I talk about this too. It's like, don't get mad at me for not unloading the dishwasher if the expectation wasn't set that I was good, supposed to unload the dishwasher. Now, if you set the expectation and I don't do it, that's a totally different thing. Barbara Matthews, the chief people officer remote, has this, she calls it the culture of no surprises. And it kind of lends
I love
itself
it.
to like the Kim Scott radical
Yes.
candor sort of thing. But it's so true. Like nobody wants to be surprised with bad news. Like to have, take performance conversations is probably the easiest example, but why are we not talking about that all the time, good or bad? I mean, I think it's important to highlight all the positive stuff that's going on. It's probably more important to highlight all the positive stuff that's going on as well. But yeah, it seems so obvious when you say it out loud, but if you actually think about it, and I self-reflection too, try to like consistently think about these things too. It's like, am I actually, embodying what I espouse here? Like, am I holding myself to that same standard?
Yeah. On that note, I'd be really interested, specifically the idea of performance management in a remote world. How have you found that? Because there's, a couple different ways I could see it. And one way I could see it being easier to give feedback because there's more separation, but then it's also easier to avoid giving feedback because there's more separation. What have you found?
Yeah, I think that's true. A lot of that's, I mean, it's almost entirely on the manager. I
Yeah.
feel like you've got to really, make an effort, and also the timing of it is important too. Gentleman by the name of Dr. Jeff Miller, who is the chief learning officer at Cornerstone, brought this really interesting concept to bear, which I've tried to continue carrying forward in my not just my management career, but also just personal relationships, friendships, those sorts of things. But before you give somebody feedback, to actually ask them if they're in a place to receive feedback.
Hmm.
Which again seems super simple, but sometimes you're having a bad day, you got a lot on your mind, and your ability to receive that information is not there.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really open and honest question. That's also disarming because then once somebody tells you, like, yeah, I can take some feedback, it sort of, I mean, maybe remove some of the barriers that might have potentially popped up otherwise. But
Yeah.
I think that, remote or not, is very important. But also being cognizant of what's going on in somebody's day, just more generally. It's harder to tell if we're not in an office together. I can't read your body language. I haven't seen
Mm.
you running around the office all day or something like that. So, have I actually taken the time to consider what's going on in Matt's world before I sit down and try to have a performance conversation? And then the only other thing I'd add is, I think, like many things, feedback is much more easily digestible in small bites. So
Yeah.
if it's something that's kind of part of your normal process, we're in this culture of giving and receiving feedback. And that's important too. Like also being open as the leader to receiving feedback and kind of checking your ego at the door. I find that that's much more constructive to kind of have this bidirectional, running dialogue essentially about just how things are going, and then it doesn't all, snowball into this massive performance conversation that kind of, hits you like a brick when you're least expecting it.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, Patrick, we've covered a lot of ground on the idea of remote work, touched on asynchronous work, feedback. To finish out, we always kind of finish the same question, pretty broad question. If you could change one thing about the world to make it better, what would it be?
Awesome question. So I think for me, and I'll circle back to something I was just talking about around ego. I'm big into Stoic philosophy, Marcus Aurelius, all that. But
Nice.
just recently finished. I'm going back and reading Ryan Holiday's books, if you're familiar.
Yes.
And
Yes.
he wrote a book. I think it's probably 7 or 8 years old now, called "Ego is the Enemy," which I just finished reading a second time. And I think if all of us were a little bit more aware of our own ego, first and foremost, it's just kind of a self-discovery piece. And then, more selective about how we let that creep into, and it's not just work, I think just our relationships in general, we'd all be a lot better off. There's a humility, I think, and I'm sure we all know these people, work for these leaders who have this humility, this kind of approachability sort of thing. And it just creates a much better environment. I feel like it's a better relationship, better work environment. So I think if we all were a little bit more aware and focused on that, checking our ego at the door, we'd all be much better off.
I love it. I think that's a great way to end, Patrick. I couldn't agree with that more. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Matt. You too. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you enjoy the discussion as much as I did. If you want to see more discussions like this, then make sure to check out some of the videos right over there. And while you're at it, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really helps improve our reach and gives us the fuel we need to bring you more of these great conversations. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we will see you next time on the Making Better podcast.